There are moments in life when you realize that the person you thought you knew best has become a complete stranger. For me, that moment came when I discovered what my daughter-in-law really thought of me, and what she was willing to do to get me out of her perfect little life. My name is Margaret. I'm 72 years old, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people closest to you can be the most dangerous, and how I made sure that actions have consequences. All started 3 years ago when my husband Robert passed away from a sudden heart attack. We'd been married for 48 years, and losing him felt like losing half of myself. My son David, my only child, was devastated too. Robert had been his hero, his mentor, everything a father should be. In those dark months after the funeral, David would come by every day, checking on me, making sure I was eating, helping me sort through Robert's things. We grieved together, and I thought we'd grown closer than we'd ever been. That's when he met Jessica. She was 28, 12 years younger than David, working as a marketing coordinator at some tech startup downtown. Pretty in that polished, Instagram-ready way that seems so important to young people these days. Long blonde hair, perfect makeup, always dressed like she was heading to a photo shoot. David was completely smitten from their first date, and honestly, I was happy for him. After watching him struggle through his divorce 5 years earlier, seeing him smile again felt like a miracle. But from the very beginning, something felt off about Jessica. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things that nagged at me. The way she'd roll her eyes when David would mention visiting me. How she'd change the subject whenever he talked about family memories or traditions. The fake smile she'd plaster on whenever she had to interact with me directly. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I was just having trouble adjusting to sharing my son's attention. They got engaged after dating for only 8 months. I remember the day David called to tell me the news. He was so excited, talking a mile a minute about how Jessica was the one, how she made him feel alive again. I wanted to be happy for him. I really did. But when they came over for dinner to celebrate, I watched Jessica's face carefully. She smiled and said all the right things, but her eyes told a different story. Cold, calculating, like she was already planning something I couldn't see. The wedding was beautiful. I'll give her that. Jessica had impeccable taste and an unlimited budget, thanks to the inheritance David had received when Robert died. 200 guests at some fancy country club, flowers flown in from Ecuador. A dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. I played my role perfectly, the proud mother of the groom, smiling for photos and giving a heartfelt speech about welcoming Jessica to our family. But even as I spoke those words, I felt like I was performing in a play where I didn't know the ending. Things started to change almost immediately after they got back from their honeymoon in Italy. David's daily visits became weekly, then every other week, then sporadic. When I'd call him, Jessica would often answer his phone, claiming he was busy or in the shower or tied up with work. She'd promised to have him call me back, but he rarely did. When we did talk, our conversations felt stilted, like he was reading from a script with Jessica coaching him from the sidelines. I started noticing other changes too. David had always been close with his childhood friends, guys he'd known since elementary school. Suddenly, he stopped seeing them. When I asked about Mike or Steve or any of the others, he'd make vague excuses about being busy with married life. Jessica was slowly but systematically isolating him from everyone who had been important to him before she came along. The holidays that first year were particularly painful. David and I had maintained all of Robert's traditions after he died. We'd make his famous Christmas morning pancakes, watch the old home movies, tell stories about Christmases past. It was our way of keeping his memory alive and staying connected to each other. But when I suggested we continue the tradition, Jessica immediately shot it down. "Oh, Margaret," she said with that saccharine smile, "David and I want to start our own traditions now. We can't live in the past forever." The way she emphasized our own made it crystal clear that I wasn't included in whatever future she was planning. That's when I started to understand what was really happening. Jessica wasn't just trying to build a life with my son. She was trying to erase his old life completely, and I was the biggest reminder of everything she wanted him to forget. Every family photo, every shared memory, every tradition we'd built over the years was a threat to the new identity she was creating for him. I tried talking to David about it, but she'd done her work well. Whenever I brought up concerns about how we barely saw each other anymore, he'd get defensive. "Mom, I'm a married man now," he'd say. I have to prioritize my wife. You have to understand that. And I did understand that, to a point. But there's a difference between prioritizing your spouse and completely abandoning your family. The real turning point came about 18 months after their wedding. I'd been having some health issues, nothing serious, but concerning enough that my doctor wanted to run some tests. I called David to let him know, thinking he'd want to come with me to the appointment like he used to do when Robert was sick. Instead, I got Jessica on the phone. "Oh, Margaret, that's such a shame," she said in that fake concerned voice. "But you know, David's really swamped at work right now. Maybe you could ask one of your friends from church to go with you instead." The casual dismissal in her tone made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about David being busy. This was about Jessica making sure I understood my place in their lives, which was apparently nowhere. That's when I decided I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I'm not proud of what I did next, but desperate times call for desperate measures. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Carol, who specialized in family matters. I told her I suspected my daughter-in-law was trying to isolate my son from his family, and I wanted to know what she was really up to. What Carol discovered over the next 6 weeks shocked me to my core. Jessica hadn't just met David by chance at some coffee shop like they'd told everyone. She'd specifically targeted him. She'd done research, found out about Robert's death, learned about the inheritance, even discovered details about David's divorce and his relationship with me. She'd positioned herself in places where she knew he'd be, engineered their accidental meetings, and manipulated their entire courtship. But that wasn't even the worst part. Carol had managed to record several conversations between Jessica and her best friend, a woman named Brittany, who was apparently her partner in this scheme. In these recordings, Jessica talked openly about her plan to eliminate the mother-in-law problem once and for all. She'd already convinced David to move across town, farther from me. Her next step was to get him to sell the family home where I'd lived for 30 years and use the proceeds to buy them a bigger house in an expensive neighborhood. "The old bat is sitting on a gold mine," Jessica had said in one recording, her voice dripping with contempt. "That house has to be worth at least $800,000 now. Once David inherits it, we can sell it and upgrade our whole lifestyle. But first, we need to figure out how to get her out of the picture permanently." When Carol played me that recording, I felt something inside me break and reform into something harder, colder. This woman had married my son for his money, was systematically destroying his relationships with everyone who loved him, and was actively plotting to steal my home out from under me. But what hurt most was the realization that David was either completely blind to what was happening or didn't care enough to stop it. I spent days thinking about what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to confront David directly, to play him the recordings and hope it would open his eyes. But I knew Jessica well enough by then to understand that she'd find a way to turn it around, to make me look like the villain. She'd probably claim I was a bitter old woman making up stories because I couldn't accept that my son had moved on with his life. No, I needed a different approach, something more subtle but ultimately more devastating. If Jessica wanted to play games, I was going to show her that she'd picked the wrong opponent. You see, what Jessica didn't know about me is that before I became a full-time mother and housewife, I'd worked in corporate America for 15 years. I'd climbed my way up from secretary to regional manager in a male-dominated insurance company. And I'd learned how to play hardball with the best of them. Robert used to joke that I could negotiate peace in the Middle East if I put my mind to it. I'd been out of the game for a long time, but some skills never leave you. The first thing I did was secure my own assets. I met with my lawyer and made sure my will was ironclad, with specific provisions that would prevent Jessica from getting her hands on anything that belonged to me. Even if something happened and David inherited everything, I also set up a trust that would ensure my house could never be sold without my explicit consent, regardless of what David might want to do. Then I started gathering more evidence. Carol had given me the tools I needed to document Jessica's behavior, and I began building a comprehensive file of every manipulation, every lie, every calculated move she made. I recorded phone conversations where she badmouthed me to David. I documented the times she deliberately scheduled events to conflict with family gatherings. I even got photos of her meeting with real estate agents, looking at houses that were way beyond what David could afford on his salary alone. But I knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough to break the spell Jessica had cast over my son. I needed to attack the thing she cared about most, her image, and her social status. You see, Jessica was one of those people who lived for social media, for the admiration and envy of others. Her Instagram account was carefully curated to present this picture of the perfect life with the perfect husband. She posted constantly about their romantic dinners, their weekend getaways, their designer purchases. Her entire identity was built on this facade of having it all. That's when I came up with my plan. If Jessica wanted to isolate me from my son, I was going to make sure she lost the one thing that mattered most to her, her precious reputation and the comfortable lifestyle she'd built on lies and manipulation. I started small. I began commenting on her social media posts. Nothing too obvious at first. Just little observations that might make people look twice. When she posted about their expensive anniversary dinner, I'd comment something like, "So wonderful that David is treating you so well with his inheritance money." When she shared photos from their latest vacation, I'd add, "Robert would have loved seeing the places his hard work helped you visit." To anyone else, these might have seemed like innocent grandmother comments, but I could tell they were making Jessica nervous. Next, I started reaching out to people in their social circle. Jessica had made the mistake of befriending several women from David's workplace, wives of his colleagues who she thought could help her climb the social ladder. I began having coffee dates with these women, sharing my concerns about how much David had changed since getting married. I never said anything directly accusatory about Jessica, just expressed my sadness about how distant my son had become and how worried I was about some of the financial decisions they seemed to be making. "I just don't understand how they can afford all these expensive trips and purchases," I'd say with carefully practiced confusion. "David's salary is good, but not that good. I worry they might be living beyond their means." I'd let that seed of doubt plant itself and grow naturally. The real masterstroke came when I discovered that Jessica had been lying about her own background. She'd told everyone, including David, that she came from a wealthy family in Connecticut. She'd created elaborate stories about her privileged upbringing, her private school education, her family's estate, but Carol's investigation had revealed the truth. Jessica had grown up in a trailer park in Ohio, had never graduated from college despite her claims, and had changed her name from Jennifer Sue Miller to Jessica Catherine Morrison when she moved to our city 5 years ago. I sat on this information for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to use it. That moment came at David's birthday party, which Jessica had insisted on hosting at their apartment. She'd invited about 30 people, a mix of David's colleagues, their neighbors, and a few of Jessica's friends. It was exactly the kind of gathering where she loved to hold court, impressing everyone with her sophistication and charm. I arrived early, bringing David's favorite cake that I'd made from scratch using Robert's mother's recipe. Jessica wasn't thrilled about me contributing anything to her perfect party, but she couldn't exactly turn away a homemade birthday cake from the guest of honor's mother. I chatted pleasantly with the other guests as they arrived, playing the role of the sweet grandmother perfectly. About halfway through the evening, the conversation turned to family backgrounds. Someone mentioned their own parents' immigration story, and Jessica immediately launched into her usual fabricated tale about her Connecticut blue blood heritage. She was really laying it on thick, talking about her family's summer house in the Hamptons and her debutante ball. That's when I struck. "Oh, Jessica dear," I said with perfect innocence, "I was just thinking about your family the other day. What was the name of that private school you attended in Connecticut again? I have a friend whose granddaughter is looking at schools in that area, and I'd love to recommend it." I watched Jessica's face go pale as she stammered out some generic name, but I wasn't done. "And remind me, what town in Connecticut was it again? Was it Greenwich, New Canaan? I can never keep those fancy Connecticut towns straight." By now, several people were paying attention to our conversation, and I could see Jessica getting increasingly uncomfortable. She mumbled something about not wanting to bore everyone with old stories, but I pressed on. "Oh, it's not boring at all. I just think it's so interesting how different everyone's backgrounds are. I mean, I grew up right here in town, went to the local public schools, very different from your Connecticut estate life." That's when one of David's colleagues, a woman named Sarah who apparently knew Connecticut well, chimed in. "Oh, I love that area. What town exactly? My parents lived in Westport for years, so I know the whole Gold Coast pretty well." Jessica was trapped. She couldn't keep dodging specific questions without looking suspicious, but she also couldn't provide details about a place she'd never actually lived. I watched her struggle for a moment before deciding to put her out of her misery. You know what, Jessica? I said with a warm smile. I think I might be confusing you with someone else. Memory isn't what it used to be at my age. Please, don't let me interrupt your story. But the damage was done. I could see the doubt in people's faces, the way they were looking at Jessica, with new questions in their eyes. She tried to recover, to change the subject, but the moment had shifted. The perfect image she'd worked so hard to create had developed its first visible crack. Over the following weeks, I kept applying pressure in small, strategic ways. I'd mention Jessica's Connecticut background to mutual acquaintances, always with little inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. I'd share old photos of David's childhood on social media, always with captions that emphasized our family history and traditions. I made sure to be visible in all the places where Jessica wanted to be seen as the sophisticated wife, showing up at charity events and community gatherings where people knew both of us. But my most effective weapon turned out to be patience. You see, people like Jessica can't help themselves. When they're under pressure, they make mistakes. And Jessica was definitely feeling the pressure. She started overcompensating, trying harder and harder to prove her sophistication and worth. She began spending even more money on clothes and accessories, pushing David to buy her more expensive gifts, planning more lavish social events. That's when David started asking questions. I didn't have to say anything directly. I just waited for him to notice what I'd been seeing all along: the credit card bills that kept growing, the expensive purchases that didn't match their supposed budget, the way Jessica would get angry whenever he suggested they should save money or be more practical about their spending. The beginning of the end came when Jessica made her biggest mistake. Emboldened by what she thought was her secure position in David's life, she decided to escalate her campaign against me. She started telling David that I was becoming a burden, that my health issues were going to become expensive, that maybe it was time to consider other living arrangements for me. But she didn't stop there. She actually had the audacity to suggest that David should convince me to sell my house and move into a retirement community, with the proceeds going toward their new home purchase. She painted it as being in my best interest, claiming I'd be happier around people my own age, with organized activities and medical care nearby. When David called to have this conversation with me, I could hear Jessica coaching him in the background. My son, the boy I'd raised to be honest and caring, was stammering through a script about how much happier I'd be in a more appropriate living situation for someone my age. It broke my heart, but it also gave me the final piece I needed for my plan. I told David I'd think about it, that maybe Jessica had a point about me needing more support as I got older. I could hear the relief in his voice, and I knew Jessica was probably celebrating in the background. They thought they'd won. They thought I was just going to roll over and hand them everything they wanted. But I had one more card to play, and it was the ace I'd been saving for exactly this moment. The next day, I called David and asked him to come over alone. I told him I'd made a decision about the house, and we needed to discuss the details. He arrived that evening with a folder full of real estate information and retirement community brochures that Jessica had obviously prepared for him. He looked excited but nervous, like a kid who knows he's about to get away with something. He shouldn't, Mom, he started, settling into Robert's old chair in the living room. I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. Jessica and I have been researching some really nice places, and we think you'd love David. I interrupted quietly. Before we talk about any of that, I need to show you something. I handed him the folder Carol had prepared, the one with all the evidence of Jessica's true identity, her calculated pursuit of him, and her real motives for wanting me out of the picture. I watched his face as he read through document after document, listened to recording after recording. I saw confusion turn to disbelief, then disbelief turned to anger, then anger turned to a kind of devastated understanding. This can't be real, he whispered, but I could tell he knew it was. All those little inconsistencies he'd been ignoring. All those moments when something felt off but he'd talked himself out of questioning it. They were all falling into place now. I'm sorry, honey, I said gently. I know this is hard to hear, but I couldn't let her destroy our family without trying to save you first. She doesn't love you, David. She never did. You were just a means to an end for her. We sat in silence for a long time while David processed everything. Finally, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. How long have you known? About 6 months, I admitted. I hired an investigator because I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wanted to be wrong, David. I wanted to believe that I was just a jealous mother who couldn't let go. But the evidence speaks for itself. What happened next was the hardest part of this whole ordeal. David broke down completely, and I held my 40-year-old son while he cried like he used to when he was little and had scraped his knee or been hurt by playground bullies. But this was so much worse than any childhood disappointment. This was the complete destruction of the life he thought he'd built, the future he thought he was working toward. "What am I going to do, Mom?" he asked. "We're married. We have a mortgage together, credit cards. Her name is on everything. And what if you're wrong about some of this? What if there's an explanation?" I understood his hesitation. Even with all the evidence in front of him, part of him still wanted to believe that the woman he'd fallen in love with was real. But I also knew that Jessica wasn't going to go quietly, and David needed to be prepared for what was coming next. "The first thing you need to do is protect yourself financially," I told him. "Change your passwords, monitor your accounts, make sure she can't clean you out while you figure out your next steps. Then you need to decide if you want to confront her with this evidence or just start the divorce process." David chose to confront her, which I understood but worried about. People like Jessica don't react well when their schemes are exposed, and I was afraid she might try to hurt him even more before this was over. But David needed to hear whatever explanation she might offer, needed to give her the chance to come clean, even though we both knew she wouldn't take it. The confrontation happened 2 days later. David had asked Jessica to meet him at home, after work, telling her they needed to have an important conversation about their future. He'd hidden recording equipment around their apartment, following my advice to document everything in case she tried to deny or twist what happened. According to David, Jessica's first reaction was to deny everything. She claimed the evidence was fabricated, that I'd hired someone to create false documents because I was jealous of their relationship. She accused me of being manipulative and vindictive, of trying to destroy their marriage because I couldn't accept that David had moved on from his old life. But when David pressed her with specific details, her story started falling apart. She couldn't explain how someone could have faked so many different pieces of evidence, couldn't account for the inconsistencies in her own background story, couldn't justify the recorded conversations where she'd discussed her plans so explicitly. That's when Jessica's masks finally slipped completely. The sweet, loving wife disappeared, and the real Jessica emerged. She screamed at David that he was pathetic, that she'd done him a favor by giving him the best years of his life, that he'd never find anyone better than her. She told him his mother was a bitter old woman who would die alone and forgotten, and that he was too weak and stupid to see what was best for himself. Then she made her biggest mistake. In her rage, she confirmed everything we'd suspected and more. She admitted that she'd researched him before they met, that she'd known about his inheritance from the beginning, that she'd been planning to get me out of the picture so they could inherit my house sooner. She even admitted that she'd been having an affair with her personal trainer for the past 6 months, someone closer to her own age, who could give her the excitement that David apparently couldn't. David recorded all of it, every cool word, every admission, every revelation about who she really was beneath the carefully constructed facade. By the time Jessica realized what she'd done, it was too late. She'd destroyed herself more thoroughly than I ever could have. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. Thanks to the evidence we'd gathered and Jessica's own recorded admissions, David was able to prove fraud in their marriage. The prenup she'd insisted they sign, which would have entitled her to half of everything, including David's inheritance, was invalidated. She ended up with nothing except her personal belongings and a legal bill she couldn't afford. But I wasn't satisfied with just getting her out of David's life. Jessica had caused my son tremendous pain, had wasted 2 years of his life, and had tried to destroy our family. I wanted her to understand that actions have consequences, that you can't manipulate and hurt people without eventually paying a price. So, I made sure that everyone in Jessica's social circle knew exactly who she really was. I shared the evidence with the wives of David's colleagues, the women she'd been trying to impress with her fake sophistication. I posted her real background information on social media, not maliciously, but factually, letting people know that Jennifer Sue Miller from Ohio had been pretending to be Jessica Catherine Morrison from Connecticut. I also made sure her affair became public knowledge. The personal trainer she'd been seeing was married with 2 young children, and his wife deserved to know what kind of person she was dealing with. Sometimes doing the right thing means being willing to be the messenger, even when the message is going to hurt people. The aftermath was swift and devastating for Jessica. Her carefully constructed social media presence crumbled as people began questioning every post, every claim, every story she'd ever told. The women she'd been trying to befriend cut her off completely, embarrassed that they'd been fooled and angry about being lied to. Her affair partner ended things immediately to try to save his own marriage, leaving her completely alone. Within 3 months, Jessica had lost her job, her social circle, her reputation, and her comfortable lifestyle. She ended up moving back to Ohio, to the same small town she'd spent so much energy trying to escape. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was living with her mother again, working at a local retail store, and struggling to rebuild her life from scratch. Some people might think I went too far, that I was vindictive in my pursuit of justice, but I don't see it that way. Jessica made a choice to target my family, to manipulate my son, and to try to steal everything we'd worked for. She calculated every move, planned every deception, and showed no mercy in executing her scheme. I simply made sure that her choices had appropriate consequences. David struggled for a while after the divorce. The betrayal had shaken his confidence, made him question his judgment about people and relationships. He moved in with me for a few months while he sorted out his finances and his living situation. And honestly, it was wonderful having him home again. We spent long evenings talking about everything that had happened, processing the experience, together, rebuilding the relationship that Jessica had tried so hard to destroy. Gradually, David began to heal. He reconnected with his old friends, the ones Jessica had driven away. He started dating again, but more carefully this time, with a better understanding of red flags and manipulation tactics. He even thanked me for having the courage to investigate Jessica when he couldn't see what was happening himself. "I know it must have been hard for you to hire that investigator," he told me one evening as we were making Robert's famous pancakes together. "Part of me is embarrassed that my own mother had to save me from my wife. But I'm grateful you did. I might never have seen through her act if you hadn't shown me the evidence." That conversation meant everything to me. It confirmed that I'd made the right choice, that protecting my son had been worth the months of planning and the difficult confrontations that followed. Sometimes, love means being willing to be the bad guy, to do the hard things that need to be done, even when they make you uncomfortable. Today, 3 years after this all began, David is remarried to a wonderful woman named Sarah, who genuinely loves him for who he is, not what he can provide for her. She's kind to me, includes me in their lives, naturally, and without resentment. And most importantly, she makes David happy in a way that feels real and sustainable. They're expecting their first child in the fall, and I couldn't be more excited about becoming a grandmother. As for Jessica, I occasionally wonder what became of her, but I don't spend much time thinking about it. She made her choices, and she's living with the consequences of those choices. I hope she learned something from the experience, that maybe she'll make better decisions in the future. But that's not my responsibility anymore. What I learned from this whole experience is that sometimes the people who seem the most harmless can be the most dangerous. Jessica's weapons weren't physical violence or obvious cruelty. They were manipulation, deception, and the slow erosion of family bonds. She understood that the best way to destroy someone is to isolate them from the people who love them, to make them question their own instincts and memories. I also learned that you're never too old to fight for what matters most to you. At 72, I could have accepted Jessica's version of events, could have convinced myself that David was just growing up and moving on with his life. I could have let her slowly push me out of the picture and eventually steal everything my husband and I had worked for, but I chose to fight back, using the skills and wisdom I'd gained over 7 decades of life. If you're watching this and you recognize some of the warning signs I've described, if someone in your life is trying to isolate you from your family or manipulate your relationships, please don't ignore those instincts. Trust yourself when something feels wrong, even if you can't quite put your finger on what it is. And don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it. Sometimes we're too close to a situation to see it clearly, and an outside perspective can reveal things we've been trained not to notice. Family is everything. It's the foundation that supports us through life's challenges, the safety net that catches us when we fall, the legacy we leave behind when we're gone. Anyone who tries to destroy those bonds, who manipulates and deceives to get what they want, deserves to face the consequences of their actions. I made sure Jessica lost her comfort because she tried to steal mine, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat to protect the people I love. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, and justice has a way of finding people who think they're clever enough to avoid it. Jessica learned that lesson the hard way, and my family is stronger than ever because of it. Sometimes you have to be willing to play the long game, to be patient and strategic and absolutely ruthless when someone threatens what matters most to you. That's exactly what I did, and I've never regretted it for a single moment.